this unique service tonight, and we're not going to mess around. We're going to get right into this because I know a lot of you are eager to be part of this presentation that we're going to have tonight. So let me introduce two friends to you. One is a newish friend in that Randal Rauser has been a friend of mine just over the last few years, developed a good relationship with him. He's become, for me, a go-to guy that I love to have Vietnamese pho with. We generally, whenever we go to lunch, it's always Vietnamese. We love that. We also share a love of motorcycles and of theology and church history and all of that. And so Randal's a guy that stimulates my thinking, and tonight he's going to stimulate your thinking as well. He's local. He's from Taylor Seminary right here in Edmonton, and we'll welcome him in just a second. And then the other friend I want you to meet is Justin Schieber. He's a new friend in maybe the last hour and a half or so. So we're working on our relationship. We're going to be close before the night's over. Justin is from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and if you want to follow him and learn more about what he's all about, you can follow him on Twitter at Real Theology and learn about his worldview, and you're going to experience some of that tonight. Randal and Justin have written a book together, and it's called An Atheist and a Christian Walk Into a Bar. Now, they're doing a similar presentation in another church in this area this weekend, and at that particular venue, they changed it to An Atheist and a Christian Walk Into a Church. We're going with the bar thing, hoping you're okay with that. We're just going to be all right. That's fine. We can do that here. But Justin and Randal, what they're going to do tonight is they're each going to share for a few minutes to kind of help you understand where they're coming from, helping you understand their particular worldview. And then I'm going to moderate the rest of this, about an hour or so, with letting you ask your questions. And we're going to give you a chance to respond in this way. If you'd like to ask a question at any point during the service, there's going to be a number. It'll be up on the screens as well. But the number is 587-400-2267. 400-2267, and 587 is the prefix. And if you want to send a question by text, we will gather them, we will look for themes, and then we will pose some of those questions to Justin and Randal as we go along. So that number will come up here in just a few minutes. So that's how we're going to proceed. We're going to be casual, we're going to be friends, we're going to have a very stimulating, interactive evening here together. And by the way, if you're a young adult in the room, sort of that young adult being 18 to 20-something-ish, after this experience tonight, Justin and Randal are going to spend some time with you in a gathering you're going to have as well. So you'll get an extra shot at these guys later on as well. But for now, would you please, everybody, welcome Justin and Randal.
Better introduce who's who unless it's not obvious.
Okay, I'm Randal, and that's Justin.
Hello.
And although we're going with the bar theme, this is just water.
Suddenly I'm disappointed.
Yeah, depending on how things go, you might want something else. We'll see. So we each want to begin by just giving a few minutes talk introductory. I think I'm going to begin on a day that many of us remember, which is September 11th, 2001. I suspect many of us remember what was going on that day. What I want to talk about is one aspect of the aftermath of 9/11. About 3 years after 9/11, a book was published which went to the top of the bestseller charts called The End of Faith by Sam Harris. Sam Harris was one of the leaders of what would later be called the New Atheism. And the New Atheism distinguished itself against religion by being much more vocal in its denunciation of religion and of belief in God than atheists had previously been. And one of the hallmarks of the New Atheists, people like Sam Harris, is that they believed religion is irrational, belief in God is irrational, and can lead to violence, such as you had at 9/11. And so they felt compelled to speak out against it. Richard Dawkins, another very well-known New Atheist, his 2006 book, The God Delusion, sold over 2 million copies. And Richard Dawkins dismisses people who believe in God as faith heads, which is not a good term. So things took a very negative tone in the wake of 9/11 between atheists and Christians. But that's not actually where it started. I wrote a book a couple years ago analyzing Christian attitudes toward atheists over the last 300 to 400 years. And we haven't generally been much better. In fact, we've been pretty bad very often. I'll give you one example. Joseph Addison, an 18th century Christian leader, described atheists as vermin, people to be annihilated. So the fact that the new atheists were more vocal in the last few years is a fact that for a long time Christians have had a very negative attitude toward atheists. Justin and I both repudiate that kind of firing of incendiaries at one another. And what we're aiming for is a much more collegial, friendly dialogue so we can begin to understand where the other person is coming from. Henry Nouwen, a well-known Christian leader, said that listening is the highest form of hospitality. And I hope that we can all extend some hospitality to those with whom we disagree simply by listening to them. Well, one aspect of dialogue is willingness to confront some deep divisions and differences with one another. Be willing to talk about why you disagree and not feel that you have to be threatened by that fact. And so what we want to do to start us off is say a few words about why we view the world differently. Why I'm a theist, why Justin's an atheist, and we're just going to use that then as a platform for a free-for-all in terms of questions, hopefully with you. So I want to begin first with an illustration. A few years ago, I wanted to streamline my computer, so I started deleting programs from it that I deemed to be unnecessary for the function of the computer. And I discovered at some point that one of those programs was actually essential for the computer. I thought that I was just making the computer run better, but by deleting that program, it now no longer functioned the way it was supposed to. And in my view, belief in God is something like that program, that it is important for the most holistic, comprehensive, helpful, and existentially satisfying understanding of the world. I just want to give you two quick illustrations of why I think that's so, but there are so many more that I could talk about. First one I just want to talk about is a thing that I've often thought about, which is knowledge. How we know things in the world. The philosophers talk a lot about this question of epistemology, which is the question of how do you know things? How do you have rational beliefs about the world? Let me begin with an illustration. You're walking along and you see a clock on the side of the street telling the time. Now, all things being equal, it's reasonable for you to trust the time the clock gives you, right? And there's a reason for that. Because you believe that there was a clockmaker who made the clock, that clockmaker made the clock with the intention of it accurately telling the time, and then somebody set that clock so that it would accurately reflect what the time is. Based on those background beliefs, you can reasonably come to know what the time is based upon the clock. Now consider another situation. And in this other situation, you come across a clock in the forest. But this clock was not actually made by anybody to tell the time. It was assembled through random processes by chance. I grant that's a little bit unlikely, but just concede this for the sake of argument. Would it be reasonable for you to trust the time that clock gave? I would say no. And the reason is because that clock wasn't designed with the purpose of accurately telling you what the time is. Now, I think that this illustrates the difference between theists and atheists when it comes to knowledge, the question of how we can know things. The theist should believe, that God designed us in order that we would be able to gain true beliefs about the world. And so all things being equal, it's reasonable for us to trust the deliverances of our sense perception, of our reasoning processes. It's not infallible, but we can reasonably trust it. But if you believe that human beings weren't created to gain knowledge of the world, to learn truth, if you believe that our cognitive faculties, our sense perception, was simply emerged randomly because it was adaptive to the environment, but not because it gave us truth, then I think you would have a reason to doubt the deliverances of your cognitive faculties, of your mind. And that's, I think, a very important difference that Christianity has over atheism. It grounds a much more reasonable assent to our beliefs. That's kind of abstract, okay? I recognize that. But let me end with a much more practical consideration. And this is the consideration that only theism, I think, can really ground hope in the deepest sense. I'm going to give to you a couple illustrations from Woody Allen. Woody Allen is a well-known filmmaker and somebody who himself, he's an atheist, and he has long wrestled with the question of meaning and purpose in life. In his 1986 film, Hannah and Her Sisters, Woody Allen plays a character named Mickey, who's always concerned that he is going to die soon, that he's contracted some fatal illness. And so Mickey goes to the doctor one day and has all these brain scans done because he's convinced that he has a brain tumor. The doctor walks back in with his charts, and Mickey's waiting to hear the worst news he can imagine. And the doctor says to him, "You're perfectly fine." Immediately, a sense of relief washes over Mickey, and he bounds out of the clinic. He's so happy. But then suddenly he stops walking, and his shoulders slump, and his head goes down. In the next scene, he explains to a friend why. He says, all right, so I'm not going to go today, but eventually I'm going to be in that position. He realized that this diagnosis of a clean bill of health from the doctor was only a temporary reprieve from his mortality. Eventually he would die, and that reality hit him again. Well, Woody Allen himself, in an interview, in a documentary, made the point like this. He said, "I always use my concentration camp example of people around me having fun, enjoying themselves. And I want to say to them, don't you realize that you're going to go up in a smokestack? So why are you so happy?" We all know the truth, and our lives consist in how we choose to distort it. Well, that's a pretty bleak picture, but the reality is that on atheism, there is no life after death, there is no hope after death, there is no promise of justice being visited upon the world, there is no extension of grace going into eternity. Theism, and Christian theism in particular, offers that hope. It offers the prospect of eternal life. It offers the promise of justice. It offers the promise of grace and hope.
Well, good evening. My name is Justin Schieber. I'm delighted to be speaking with you guys today about these issues. Randal and I have been good friends for a number of years, and actually this is my third time being in Edmonton. Roughly, I want to say, well, actually 2 years ago. Actually 2 years ago to yesterday, we participated in a couple of debates over a weekend, and the dialogue was really quite successful. It was really helpful. We managed to kind of avoid those, the lobbing bombs at each other, that the rhetorical bombs that are so often the kind of modus operandi of these kind of conversations. And so I think we both recognize that, and as a result, Randal communicated to me a few months later, "Hey, what do you think about writing a book on this?" And initially I was a bit hesitant, but eventually he convinced me, and we started to partake in this project, and I think we had a really great time coming to better understand each other. Some of the complexities, we had perhaps some oversimplified views of each other's beliefs, and I think we both benefited from that exchange. And so in that spirit, here we are tonight. So I'm an atheist. Some of the, one question that might pop up is, well, why are you an atheist? What are some of the reasons I find compelling for being an atheist? And these are reasons, and the reasons I'm going to give you are not reasons that are going to prove it. Right? I'm not going to deconvert all of you this evening, so don't worry about that. Rather, I'm just going to give some evidence that I find compelling, and I'm going to provide some reasons that perhaps you should find these evidences compelling as well. So, what are these evidences? Well, let's start off with a little story here. So I'm going to stop shaking this because you might be able to hear that. So imagine two young brothers, okay? Now, these brothers are being raised by a single parent, and they're identical in their age. They're identical in their maturity level, and they're identical in other relevant ways. Now, let's say for some odd reason that they don't quite understand, their parent, that their single parent that raises them only communicates privately with each of them. The parent never speaks to them both at the same time. Now, that's kind of odd, I suppose, right? But it's not particularly problematic. But let's say then that as siblings do, they start to communicate and they find out there are some radically different beliefs that they hold about their parent. And so as they've formed these beliefs while being in communication privately with their parent, and yet nonetheless, they've come to discover that many of these beliefs that they hold are actually incompatible. So what gives? How do we explain this, right? Now, the analogy here that I'm kind of drawing is among theistic believers, so among persons who believe in God, among persons who believe who genuinely believe and feels very strongly that they have a relationship with the creator of the universe, and that this creator of the universe is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. Okay, so there's a lot of believers, a lot of persons that believe this. We call them theists. Now, some theists believe fundamentally different things about this individual than do other theists. So if we go back to the parent analogy, if it were the case that the children had these different beliefs, sometimes differences on important relational matters about your parent, or different beliefs about moral matters, they are going to create a tension that will persist between those persons. It'll be a kind of knot in their relationship, right? It'll cause tension in their relationship. But not only the relationship between the children themselves, but also between the children and their parent, right? So these disagreements are deep disagreements, are disagreements of fundamental issues, and so they introduce this kind of tension. Now, if we go back to theism, you can find theistic believers on all sides of every controversial moral issue, all throughout time and all throughout the world, okay? So take your pick of the various controversial moral issues that we've ever really confronted as humans. Some of the more modern ones, I suppose, are things like gay marriage or abortion, things like these, things that really speak to the core of our moral selves. And yet, there are people, theists, who believe that they have a relationship with the creator of the universe on both sides of all of these issues. They also hold differences in beliefs about how best to interact with their parent, how best to form a relationship with their God, right? So some people believe that the best way to enter into a relationship with God is through performing the right kind of moral acts, for being a good person, right? That you earn a kind of favor in the eyes of God. Other persons believe that it's really about faith. It's about a kind of deep fundamental trust, humbling yourself before God and asking for forgiveness in that way. These are fundamentally different views of these things. And there are other disagreements as well. Some disagreements are rather severe, and they cause not only relationship tension, but they can cause violence. For example, if you thought that you had special awards for you in heaven, if, for example, you were to martyr yourself for the cause of a religious ideology, then, of course, that's going to have pretty devastating effects on other individuals, right? So the issue here that I'm pointing at is this disagreement, and that this kind of widespread theological disagreement on both moral issues and relational issues among committed, devout, believing theists is something that is far better explained on a view like mine, an atheistic view, than on a view like Randal's and yourselves, a kind of theistic view. Okay? So that's one reason why, that's one piece of evidence, right? Obviously it doesn't prove it, but another piece of evidence, let's think about that. So Randal talked about 9/11, right? 9/11 was a time of great suffering for this country. It was a time of, or rather my country, yours as well, I'm sure. I don't think there was a person in the world who wasn't affected in a deep way by those events of that day. But there's the problem of suffering. Now, typically philosophers kind of group this problem into two different categories. So you have moral suffering, and then you have natural suffering. So moral suffering is the kind of suffering which is the result of, say, an abuse of a moral decision, right? So you get angry and you lash out at someone and you hurt them, or you do something, you steal from someone and they suffer as a result. These are the kinds of moral suffering I have in mind. These are rather light examples of it. Obviously, 9/11 is an extreme example. And of course, you have all the atrocities throughout human history that are also, that count as moral suffering. But the other category of suffering, natural suffering, is, I would argue, a much larger problem. So natural suffering is suffering that is the result, or that is not the result of human persons. So natural suffering can happen to human persons. It can also happen to non-human animals. So if we talk about the wild, right? Right now there are thousands of animals being slowly eaten alive. Still others are running for their lives in terror, utter terror. And others are starving just because the resources they're in an unprivileged area of the natural world. Some experience drought, famine, disease. And what's really interesting about the predatory issue of natural suffering is that the kind of natural selection that occurs in nature isn't just an accidental byproduct of a particularly well-designed system. Rather, the suffering and the death is intrinsic to the system. So this is the way it's set up. In fact, if there ever is a time of plenty within the natural world, that will automatically lead to an increase of the population, and then therefore, again, it'll repeat back to a struggle for survival of the limited resources available. So these instances of suffering, both moral and natural, I argue, are things that we have no reason to find surprising on an atheistic view. The natural world does not care for us any more than it cares to keep a particular comet on course. It just does not care. But on theism, humans are special. Suffering is bad. These things are things you would not expect to see to the degree and the intensity that we do observe them in the natural world. And so, again, I submit that the suffering in the world, both natural and moral, is strong evidence for atheism and against theism. So, those are my two arguments. Thank you very much.
They're clapping. It's pretty good.
Yeah, they didn't clap after this guy.
I noticed.
They want to be polite. So listen, we want to roll on this, baby, because the questions are coming in, and so you can't take as long as you took for the, we're gonna motor here.
Boom.
Okay. So let me start here, and Randal, I'll put this first question to you because I believe it's directed at you, and that is the conversation about suffering. That's like almost like the first thing you'll hear from a lot of people representing your worldview. Like, that's a biggie, right?
Sure.
So would you give us a response to that whole idea of suffering, both the two different types even, but let's at least, we're not going to solve this one obviously, but give us a shot at that one, would you please?
Sure. So let me start off. I have to stand when I talk. Yeah. Let me start off by saying at the outset we need to distinguish between two different issues. And one issue is the pastoral question of suffering, and the other one is the intellectual problem of suffering. Just in the last week, I met with a friend was in a car accident 5 years ago, and his daughter died in the car accident. And one thing he said to me is, whenever someone says to me, well, at least, he says, at that point I turn off. I don't want to hear anything else. They try to offer, well, at least, she's in heaven or something. And they mean well, right? But they're trying to give comfort words that are hollow. Nicholas Wolderstorff, a well-known Christian philosopher, probably his most poignant book ever was a book called Lament for a Son, which was his own reflection on suffering in light of the death of his son in a mountaineering accident. And in that book, he says, come and sit on my mourning bench with me. Just like Jesus wept, be willing to weep with me, to identify with those who suffer, which can be a pretty scary and daunting thing. But I think the first thing we always have to do in question of suffering is to be willing to suffer with people. Now, in terms of the intellectual problem, and so I wanted to say, when people suffer is not the time to share intellectual responses to the problem of suffering or evil. That's for the seminar room. That's for the debate hall. But in terms of those kinds of responses, two very quick ones. So one of them is very classic standard response, but I think a very important response is that God can allow suffering because he envisions bringing some greater good out of that suffering. Now, just today, I was telling some people, I watched this afternoon the film Sully, about the miracle on the Hudson back in 2009 when this United U.S. Airways plane, they were hit in their engines by birds, and both engines were blown out, and they had to crash land on the Hudson River. And so this pilot, Sully Sullenberger, had to make this split-second decision, and they piloted down onto the river. Now, one thing that I saw as I watched that film is the extraordinary courage of not only Sully, but also his co-pilot, the flight attendants, the other people on the boat, on the plane, which became a boat. And speaking of boats, also all these ships that came from out of nowhere on the Hudson immediately converged on there. The divers that jumped from helicopters to save passengers. And then the repercussions, the impact of this going forward for months afterwards. And what you see in the film is an enormous amount of good in terms of the development of character in people. But it all came out of this one event that lasted for this period of time. I think very often when we are suffering, we are on the airplane, right? And it's going down, and we cannot envision how God could possibly allow this kind of suffering in our lives. To know at least that God has to have some reasons, some purposes. He's not asleep at the switch. And so part of the response to the problem of evil, I think, is to recognize that he can have these greater goods that he's going to bring out of those periods of suffering in our lives. One last thing, because I know I have to move here. I'm getting the glare. Last thing is also a point to recognize that because God is infinitely greater and more knowledgeable than us, it's not a surprise if we can't envision all the possible reasons God could have for allowing evil, because he's infinite and we are but finite.
Thanks, Randal. Justin, let's let you have a shot
Sure.
At something that Randal talked about in his opening comments, and that would be if the suffering, the suffering is a big card played quickly by those from the atheist community. Sure. You have no hope if you're an atheist is the other card that's quickly played by theists. Yeah. Do you want to respond to that one, that sense that to hold the worldview that you do,
Sure.
Well, that's such a hopeless existence. You want to respond to that?
Yeah. No, I think it's an understandable intuition, I think. Because at the end of the day, at least most atheists are not going to believe in an afterlife. And that can seem rather depressing. But here's the way I look at it. So, for example, if I go to the ice cream shop and I purchase, my favorite treat, and someone else goes and it turns out that they're the daughter of the ice cream shop owner, right? She has access to all the ice cream that she could possibly want. There is an unlimited supply of ice cream, as far as practically speaking. But me, I'm rather poor, so I can only afford a cone, right? Now, the fact that that cone will eventually end doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it. In fact, one could argue that proportionally speaking, I'm capable of appreciating it more because of the fact that I do not have an unlimited supply. Now, and so the obvious metaphor here is that my time is limited, and I believe that my time is limited. And as a result, it drives me to make the best of the very limited time that I have here. It drives me to value my experiences, my interactions with my family and my friends. It drives me to value those more and to suck every good bit about those relationships I can in the short time I can be here. And the same, of course, is true when I meet a friend who is sick or something, and I think that perhaps they don't have, they have limited time. It helps us appreciate our time together in that sense. Now, of course, it's all going to end on atheism, but I think that, again, there's a way in which that we can actually appreciate it, arguably, to a higher degree because of that finiteness. So that's kind of how I would respond to that. There's a degree of hopelessness, but there's also a degree of increased appreciation of the life that we have here on earth.
Let me ask a question of both of you. So the question has to do with your view of human nature and whether we are, as human beings, inherently good or evil. So how do you, either of you, defend your view of human nature, whether or not, whether man is inherently good or evil in the light of your belief system, in light of your worldview? Make sense?
Sure. Blaise Pascal, famous Christian philosopher from the 17th century, said that human beings are both the glory and the refuse of the universe. In other words, we are capable of the greatest acts of mercy and goodness, nobility, love, and also the most debased acts. And I think that empirically that's true. And I think it also matches very closely onto a Christian anthropology or a Christian view of human beings, because a Christian view of human beings is that we are simultaneously made in the image of God, created in the imago Dei, the image of God. We, in our best moments, exemplify certain attributes of God, but also we are in rebellion against God, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And I think empirically you just need to read the newspaper to see evidence of that fact. So I find that the Christian understanding of human nature has a lot of empirical corroboration to it.
I also agree that obviously it's a mixed bag, right? We're capable of, as that comment of Blaise Pascal said, we're capable of great goods, and we're capable of the deepest depravities, right? And I think, obviously there's going to be different explanations of this. I think that this is also something that is perfectly explainable on an atheistic view, right? In one sense, we do have lowly origins, right? But in another sense, once we acquire certain cognitive capacities and we start to be able to form empathy for individuals, because we recognize the kind of moral barriers that we have around each other, and we can recognize each other's value in that sense. And as a result, we are able and capable of great goods, of sacrificing ourselves for our fellow man, of caring deeply for our family and of our friends. But at the same time, it's absolutely a mixed bag. We are, history is filled with some of the darkest moments in human history.
This is hard to do, to read all of this while you're talking and try to, so I'm learning something here a lot. So
they're sending in essays, apparently.
Yeah, no, well, not quite. Some really interesting stuff here for sure.
Let's go to a little less heady question and maybe a little bit more of a hard question. I'm going to throw this to you, Justin, first. Sure. I'm going to ask you a similar question, Randal. Justin, have you always been an atheist? And if not, what made you change your mind or move in this direction?
Sure, yeah, great question. I was not always an atheist. I was raised in a Christian home, and around kind of mid to early teens, I stopped believing. The causes they're difficult to recall, but from what I can remember, it was just a dramatic shift in intuitions. There was I believed the Bible. I read it all the time. I knew the stories, but there was a point at which, my reading the Bible of these stories, I kind of sat there and I thought, do I really believe that these are real historical claims? Or do I believe something more vague, like these are spiritually true, right? Whatever that means. I don't know what that means. But there's a sense in which I had a difficult time thinking of some of the events recorded in the biblical text, primarily ones found in the Old Testament, as being events that happened to real persons like you and me, who had, skin cells that would fall off their hands, who had like real mortal bodies. It wasn't a particular argument. It wasn't an intellectual change. That all came later when I started to think about these things in a deeper way. But there was just a shift in intuitions, and it was a terrifying moment in my life. But nevertheless, it occurred, and I kind of had to just deal with it. So.
Randal, let me ask you this question. I'm reading your newest book, which is yet to be published, and it's your story in many ways, your story of faith, and you described some pretty radical shifts. So Justin described one kind of a radical shift in his life. Would you talk a little bit about some of the shifts you've made? You've became that theist, that Christian at a certain age, but you've evolved quite a bit too, and you've become a more passionate follower of Christ. What have been some of the things that have led you down that path?
Whoa, that's a big one.
Yeah, sorry, that probably can't be done in 2 minutes, but
because it's a 300-page book. When I was 5 years old, we were driving down the road, and my mom turned into the back seat and she said, you really need to make a decision. Are you going to choose God? Are you going to follow Jesus, or are you going to follow, or not follow, so be friends with Jesus or be friends with the devil? And I was like, whoa, can't I? And then I realized I got it. I can be friends with both because I didn't want to choose. I didn't want to offend either one of them. So I suggested that to her, and she didn't think that was a good idea. So later on that day, I prayed my own version of a sinner's prayer. And nominally, you could say that was the moment at which my journey started. Well, to talk about one point where I've changed over the years, it's to say, I was raised in what you'd call a conversionist tradition, where it's all about having a moment. You have that moment where you pray the sinner's prayer, and if you don't have that, then you're questionable, because you need to have that one moment. You need to know the day you were saved. In fact, even in university, I had a debate with a friend of mine who seemed to be a Christian. He thought he was a Christian. He acted like a Christian, but he didn't know the day he was saved. And I was trying to persuade him that he needed to pray the sinner's prayer just to make sure. This is one of my changes, is that I now look at it, it's not so much about knowing when you became a Christian, it's about knowing that you are a Christian. It's about looking for the fruit in your life that testifies to a living relationship with Jesus Christ. So, and that for me has been led to among other things, I think a much healthier understanding of conversion, discipleship, and relationship.
Thanks, Randal. I'm going to ask this question to both of you as well. So Justin, I'll start with you. With regard to Christianity and, by extension, religion, do you think it has been or is a positive or negative force in the modern world specifically?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, geez, that's a complicated question.
Yeah, well, most of them are.
So I think, it's a complicated question. So, in the modern world, there's quite clearly a force for good that, are we talking specifically Christianity? Or
religion in general, okay. Probably more so.
It's going to depend the modern instantiations of these religions, right? So some of these religions, I think, are doing some great good. Some of them are doing pretty heinous acts at the moment, and under their current interpretations, right? It's a complex picture to kind of, it's really difficult to kind of put it all in a bag and to say what where on the scale does it point, be it good or evil. And so I don't have an answer for that question, I suppose, is I guess what I'm saying. It's a complex issue, but it's important to recognize, I think, as an atheist, that there is a real force for good in religious belief, and I think that it's important for religious believers to recognize that sometimes religious belief can be a force for evil. So hopefully that responds.
Yeah,
properly.
that's fine. Short answer on that one, Randal?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Give me another 30 seconds, maybe. Art, literature, culture, Christianity has made extraordinary contributions. Just talk about literature. I mean, in university, I studied John Milton, this great 17th century Puritan poet. 20th century, I studied Flannery O'Connor, this great North American author. Christianity has made extraordinary contributions. Just stand in the Sistine Chapel and look what Christians have accomplished in the name of their faith. Literacy rates around the world have often gone with the spread of the gospel, because Christians will often come in, if there's not an alphabet already there, Christian missionaries will make an alphabet and they'll translate the Bible into it, and then you get literacy rates spiking at 97, 98%, where they may have been 20% before. So I think that's a good thing. One more example for the positives. I think we all know the negatives as well, right? So just one more on the positive. The abolition of the slave trade. Somebody like William Wilberforce in the late 18th century in Britain made it his life's mission first to abolish the slave trade, which was accomplished in 1807, and then in 1833, just before he died, they accomplished the abolition of slavery and the liberation of slaves throughout the British Empire. And he was driven by that sense of one of his mentors, John Newton, Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound.
Okay, we're going to get heavy again a little bit.
Right.
I've got 3 questions here about absolute morality, and I'm going to kind of read all 3 and let you figure out how you want to formulate that maybe into one question. But absolute morality, where does it come from? For an atheist, what is the basis of morality? Is goodness morality inherent, or is it learned? You kind of following those lines of questioning? So who wants to go first?
I'll take a crack at it.
Go for it.
So, as an atheist, how do I make sense of morality? How do I ground it, right? That's the kind of core question I think that question's shooting for. Well, there are a number of different responses to this. Among atheist philosophers, there seem to have been, there are some that just deny that morality is a thing, but of those philosophers who do think that moral values do exist, that real moral obligations do exist, they kind of fall into 2 different camps. One of those camps says that moral facts, moral properties, they're reducible, as in they can be explained fully by just facts about the natural world. Another school of thought is that moral facts cannot be. They are fundamentally different kinds of facts. They cannot be reduced or explained by just natural facts about the world. So these persons hold to the existence of certain kind of abstract moral properties. And myself personally, I'm sympathetic to that second view. And so I think that these moral properties, they don't have an explanation. They don't have a grounding. They're kind of like God in a way. So if you think about God and an atheist asks you, well, what created God, right? The obvious answer is that they've misunderstood the concept of God. And I would argue that the same is true of certain abstract, necessary moral truths. So, thank you.
We agree on that point, that moral values and moral obligations are objective. And what that means is that they are true and they are facts, even if no human being recognizes them. So as the story goes, well, if the Nazis had won World War II and they got to write history on their own terms, would it now have been true that what the final solution was good? And even if everybody came to believe that, no, it would still be false. That was evil. And that's because morality, the object is objective, which means it's independent of human beings. We discover moral values but we don't invent them, and I don't think they can be explained simply in terms of nature. Now, where Justin says, but I think that moral values just exist independently out there, I'm saying, well, if you're going to go that far, why not go a step further and say, then God also exists independently out there. And in fact, as Christians have often said, morality can be identified with God himself. So Plato, this ancient Greek philosopher, he said, he's sort of the most famous person to argue for this idea that morality is independent. It just exists out there objectively and we discover it. He's called it the form of the good. And what Christian theologians have done throughout history is said, yes, there is this objective form of the good that we discover, but it is God. It is God and his nature. So that when we learn moral facts and when we seek to cultivate and live our lives in accord with the moral good or moral value and moral obligation, we are living our lives in accord with the very nature of God.
How many of these have you guys done?
Oh, geez, we did 3 in the last 2 days.
Yeah.
Well, they're all different kinds of events. So last night we had a debate, good old-fashioned debate, and this morning we had a kind of an intimate conclave with a few people. So this is a little different, more intimidating.
What would you call this?
Scary, geez. I guess the lion's den would be appropriate.
The Lion of Judah's den.
Stop it right there.
So many inside jokes, everybody.
Hey, Rand, I'm going to so you can get ready. I'm going to make him go first so you have time to think about this.
All right, good.
Okay.
He's on my
Randal,
team.
as you guys have done these a few times, but you've not done this like dozens of times, just a few times together, right? Reflect back on either tonight or the other times that you guys have had this conversation. What is the most difficult thing that this man says or positions that he holds or belief that he holds that you have the most difficult time providing a decent response to?
So this is kind of like when you're doing a job interview and they say, what's your biggest weakness?
I care too much.
And I work too hard.
Yeah, I'm a perfectionist. What can I say? So I'll be willing to say the issue Justin raised about natural evil, and in particular the idea of the suffering of non-human sentient creatures. Now, if you take an old Earth perspective, you believe that planet Earth has been around for 4.6 billion years rather than 10,000 years. You believe that sentient life appeared on planet Earth perhaps a billion years ago, certainly several hundred million years ago, and for a long period of that time, there has been sentient life. During that time, there has been carnivory, there's been predation, there's been parasitism.
Hold on a second. You're using some words here.
Carnivory, animals eating other animals.
Carnivores.
Parasitism, so one animal depending on another host animal in a way that doesn't benefit it.
Thank you.
And what was the other one? Anyway, there's disease.
Predation. Predators.
So I give an illustration. So about 10 years ago, my daughter was young at the time, and it was Sunday evening, and we were like, let's watch PBS Sunday evening, the show Nature, but PBS, because I looked on the TV schedule, and it says this show is going to be called Born Wild, and it's about little babies being born, and like little animals being born into the world. I thought, she'll love this. It'll be really like fuzzy little kittens and puppies. It was like a chronicle of never-ending carnage. And afterwards, I had to take her to a post-traumatic stress disorder. It's an example. This is just an arachnid, but it stuck in my mind. There was this spider called an Amerobius spider, and it has this egg sac, and then all the eggs start hatching, and then the little hatchlings swarm the mother and start consuming her. And then the narrator can't help his own moral disapprobation that he calls them little monsters as they eat their mother. Now, I don't want to be unwise in projecting human characteristics onto spiders, but I can also think that if I were the one designing the system, I wouldn't have done it like that. And so this is simply something that we have to recognize, that it's kind of hard to understand at points the way nature is set up. I would also say that we shouldn't fall into a selection bias where you only look at the bad stuff, because we also need to look at the extraordinary stuff, a la Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God.
Thanks, Randal.
Yeah, so over our past interactions, the thing that I find probably the most difficult, and this is something I've always struggled with ever since I lost my faith, is the idea that when I I mean, this is kind of tied up in your argument today about hope. I think one of the most difficult things for me is that when something good happens in my life, I don't always have someone to thank for that. When something bad happens, or when I screw up, morally speaking, I don't always know that I'm going to be able to get forgiveness. Like if I screw up and it's only something that I know about and other people don't know about, there's a real struggle there to know that I can't make it right. All I can do is just try better next time. All I can do is just point toward the good and just try again. And I think that kind of, and so I think I see value in the idea that when something great happens in your life, that there's value in the idea of being able to appreciate and to thank someone for it, and to kind of humble yourself and recognize the gifts that you've been given in that way. And I can do that for persons who've positively contributed to my life, but sometimes circumstances are just good, and they're not necessarily the result of some kind action. They're just the circumstances of life. So.
Hey, Randal, with a lot of people and a lot of religions claiming to be the one and be truth, how do you defend Christianity or respond to that?
Well, what I would want to focus on is by saying, rather than talk about Christianity being the truth, talk about Christ being the truth. Jesus himself said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." The church has been called to be ambassadors or witnesses to the truth, which is Christ. And I think that sometimes we have to come to terms with and recognize some of those lamentable degrees to which we've failed to live up to that, which to some degree can come back to Justin's point about religious disagreement. One thing I do is I teach church history. And in church history, you quickly discover that the sacraments, so primarily you have communion, the Lord's Supper, and you have baptism. And these are supposed to be practices that unite the people of God. And these are practices that the people of God have constantly fought over and even killed and imprisoned one another over. And it's a pretty lamentable witness a lot of the time. So one thing I would say is Christ is the truth, and the church is to be a witness to who Christ is, and sometimes we fail. And I would also say that the truth, which is Christ, is not limited to the confines of the church. As the saying goes, all truth is God's truth. And so you can find God's truth in other places. And as Abraham Kuyper, a great Dutch theologian, said, wherever there is truth in creation, Christ claims it and says that that is mine.
Justin, I'd like to ask you a similar question, or sort of along those same lines. When
Sure.
it comes to Christians or the church, how big of an issue is the behavior of Christians for a person like you and your friends?
Yeah. I think so. Essential to the Christian story is that you're all sinners and you're all constantly falling short, right? That's a fact about everybody. We're all falling short for the standards that we recognize, right? And so to that degree, there's nothing, I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes people like to point to the hypocriticalness of, say, pastors who do unfortunate things that end up in the news, right? And I think pointing to that hypocrisy is important and is necessary. But what I would caution is to, for my own side, is to point to any kind of moral failure and to recognize and to call that hypocrisy, when really it's a recognition that you're human and that we're all falling short of our standards. And I think that that's something that is important to recognize, because ourselves we fall. If merely making a moral mistake makes us a hypocrite, then we are all hypocrites. And this is not something that, Christianity does not have the monopoly on hypocritical behavior. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that.
Just trying to play nice here.
You're being very nice. Several questions related to death. You brought that up earlier, Randal, about the fact that, we're all going to die. There's, I'm going to insert myself just for a second into this conversation between the two of you and assert that as Christians, sometimes I think we overemphasize eternity and we reduce sometimes our faith into just making sure our eternity is secure. But talk for just a little bit more about the concept of dying. And as an atheist, Justin, do you have any anxiety about dying and knowing that your mortality is real? And want to each talk about that just a little bit more?
Yeah, wow. I'm not afraid so much of death. I'm a little bit afraid of dying. I'm not excited by the prospect. And big surprise there. And we live in a culture that tries constantly to avoid mortality. We don't want to talk about death. And I think one of the things that we really need to rediscover within the Christian and evangelical tradition is an idea of dying well and of suffering. For example, very commonly in church services, in many churches I visit, in the music portion, all of the songs are upbeat, right? But if you go to the music portion of the Bible, to the Psalter, it's a very mixed bag, isn't it, right? There are upbeat songs of praise and joy and happiness. There are laments. There are curses. It's the full panoply of human experience. And I think one thing we have to do is to be honest about our own fears, our own concerns, and our own pain, and to cultivate Christian communities that welcome that we're not threatened by it. So.
Yeah, so death on atheism. I fear the process of dying, the suffering that is experienced by, I hope that when I die it's going to be quick and I'm not going to have any awareness of it, right? Some horrible, tragic situation where I get hit from behind or something. That would be ideal.
But not too soon, right?
But not too soon. Yeah, give me some time. So yeah, I don't fear not existing any more than I dread thinking about, prior to when I was born, right? It doesn't make sense to fear that state of affairs of not existing. But again, I fear the process of death. And one of the things I fear most is what late atheist author Christopher Hitchens, some of you may have heard of this fellow. So Hitchens said that it wasn't that what worried him about death wasn't the fact that the party was ending. Rather, what drove him mad about death was that the party was going on without him. And I think that is something I resonate with. I no longer get to experience those things, even though they're still going on. I think that's a real something to dread in that way. So,
hey Justin, how has your atheistic perspective or worldview, how does that square with your family or some of those that maybe raised you? Is that a pretty personal question, and you can take a pass?
No, I'm fine with sharing. They don't really actually know I'm here. So,
wait a second. What do you?
Unless they're watching the live stream, hi, Mom and Dad. So when I deconverted, it was a pretty big deal. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but they're still believers. They're still Christians. All of my family is Christian, and I have a good relationship with them. But it's the point where certain topics are no longer breached because there's a lot of sore spots there, and because of their metaphysical views, they think that something is rather tragic and in store for me upon death. And that haunts my mother in particular. And so conversations about that in particular are things that are to be avoided like the plague in my parents' house. They are they're aware that I've done some speaking in debates, but they're not aware of they're not aware that I wrote a book, for example. These are not things that I don't know. I feel like there's a tension. I feel like they would be proud of it to some degree, but at the same time, as in the work and the seriousness with which I take these topics. But then on the other hand, it's not a subject that I'm comfortable speaking with them in any real depth. And so to that degree, it's a complex relationship. And I think that the same is true for a lot of non-believers. And so I used to co-host this show, The Reasonable Doubts, and our emails were just filled with tragic situations of people, saying, you are no longer our child. You are no longer invited to come over for the holidays. You are no longer invited to celebrate Christmas because Christmas is Christ's day, right? And so I guess what I would say is if you are a parent of a child who is struggling with these issues, allow that struggle to happen and be there for them. And don't allow the differences there to part you. Because it can be quite damaging for an individual. The change that they're going through is an immense and difficult change. And they don't need the where are you going when you die question thrown at them at every opportunity. So I would just caution anybody who might be in a situation like that to avoid those kinds of unnecessary tensions. So.
Randal, I'm going to throw a weird question at you, but it's going to pick up right from where Justin left off, because I know both of you, and it's coming out in these last few comments here, your desire to showcase the fact that you can have good conversation without it getting personal or without the attacks and the bombs and all of that. Hypothetical scenario, you're sitting face to face with Justin's parents. Justin's mom, whomever. Oh, I'm sorry to do this to you. But what advice would you, because I know this is into your previous book about how we have treated people with whom we, as followers of Christ, have differences. What advice would you give to a couple of parents about how to, and maybe you can expand it even just to all of us in general, those of us in the room who are Christ followers and we try to take on somebody who doesn't share a worldview. A couple of thoughts about just how to do this and not make it worse.
Wow. I think the point I would start is that Christians have to have a sense of God's goodness and mercy and rest in that. That God is not going to lose anybody that he has his hand on. That you can't argue anybody into the kingdom of God. You cannot guilt anybody into the kingdom of God. You can't force them into the kingdom of God. It's simply beyond your control. But you can trust in a God who sent his son to offer a means and leave it in his hands. And love your family member or your friend or whoever it is and be Christ in your life. Worry less about your words. If the topic comes up, let it come up naturally, but don't force the issue. Don't find that you have to be the one that cultivates it. And certainly not that you can be the one who is somehow obligated to bring about a change in another person.
Listen, our time is about up, and I've been thinking about how the best way to end this would be. And so...
Tap dance.
What's that?
Tap dance.
Tap dance? Who's going to do it?
La La Land, big hit.
You were singing La La Land earlier, yeah.
I was.
He's been going City of Stars all day today.
Catchy tune.
So let me do this, because this has just been a taste tonight, everybody. And their book is out there, just a few copies. Randal way underestimated, in my mind, how many books they could possibly sell tonight. Yeah. I would strongly encourage you to get their book. It's on Amazon, or there's a limited number out there at the book table, and you can pick one of those up tonight. It's a very, very good read and a healthy dialogue and a good exchange. And so thank you guys for doing this. To you, Justin, in particular, to come into this environment. You're not alone here tonight. You've got friends here and all of that, and you got people. But to come into our house, into this environment, and to
put yourself out there like this is a very courageous, brave thing, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for you.
Well, I appreciate you guys listening. Appreciate the hospitality and the invitation. Yeah. Thank you.
So, would it be okay if I prayed a prayer at the end here? You okay with that?
Sure.
Okay.
This is a church.
What are you gonna? You're probably not gonna say no, right?
I'm just gonna like chill out over here.
Okay. All right. God, thanks for this experience. I pray that each of us in the room would process well what we've experienced tonight. I pray that there would be much kind and gracious and thorough and intellectually stimulating debate as a result of what's been shared. I thank you for these two guys. I pray blessing on their lives and on their work. I pray blessing on their families and on the book that they've written. And may it do some great good in this world for a lot of different people, for a lot of different reasons. And so, God, I pray that you've been honored tonight. I pray that this has been honoring to Justin as well as to Randal. And God, we leave all of this discussion in your hands. In your name we pray. Amen. Let's thank these guys one more time.
Right. Thank you so much.
Well done.